Hey there, I'm Antoids, and this is Digital Roots. In this video, I wanted to talk about some techniques that game developers use to teach players the fundamentals of their games. For the player, noticing these techniques will help them quickly adapt to the more advanced challenges in a game. A designer, on the other hand, is able to effectively and wordlessly help a player understand how to get the most out of the mechanics and abilities available to them. The concept is called flooring, and, put simply, it establishes a bare minimum for what the developer can assume the player is capable of. From there, the developer can safely build upon challenges or mechanics, confident that the player already understands the basics. So, flooring generally falls into one of three main categories: numbers, abilities, and strategies. Numbers are probably the most obvious way to floor a player's capabilities, either via their inventory or their stats. The simplest thing to do is place items along the critical path, the parts of a game the player has to experience to progress. These items can range from quest or NPC rewards to simply chests laying around for the player to open. For example, in Chrono Trigger, when first arriving in the future, the game places a chest containing a new sword in a corridor the player must pass through in order to reach their next objective. The player also finds a second sword not long after, once again along the critical path. With two new weapons placed pretty close to each other, the game's designers can be reasonably sure the player found at least one of them, and assume that they can deal a certain minimum amount of damage as a result. This means the developers can increase the difficulty of fights accordingly. Aside from weapons, developers can also floor a player's power numerically with items. Games with resource management elements, such as The Last of Us and Resident Evil, are able to instill in the player a sense of scrounging for every advantage they can get, making things as simple as ammo pickups seem tremendously meaningful at times. Resident Evil 4 in particular has an interesting implementation of this by rubber banding the items dropped in the game. What this means is that when the player is missing a lot of shots, the game takes pity on them, and drops more ammo so that it won't be prohibitively difficult to progress, but also won't make the game too easy for more accurate players. It's a pretty interesting design philosophy, and I'd like to see games employ it more often, because punishing poor play with fewer resources seems counterintuitive in some cases, as it can make the games frustratingly difficult for less skilled players. That being said, there's definitely still a place for fixed loot in games, such as in Resident Evil Revelations. In the second mission of the game, Chris falls down a ledge and has to fight off a large pack of wolves. Immediately prior to this encounter, the player finds a cornucopia of items, such as ammo pickups, explosives, and even some healing items, ensuring that once they fall into the pit, they'll be capable of surviving the waves of enemies, even if they lost a lot of resources reaching this point. In addition to creating peace of mind for the player before a big fight, the developers also know the player has access to their full roster of abilities, as well as enough HP to make some mistakes. The fight won't be too frustrating due to a lack of resources, and can take more full advantage of all the tools the developer put in the game for the player to use. In addition, this encounter functions as a test of the player's aim and item management abilities, another example of flooring that I'm going to discuss near the end of this video. Of course, items and weapons aren't the only ways to control the numerical capabilities of a player. In many games, there's something like an automatic stat increase on level up, or a point buy system. Typically, games with these systems differentiate characters by turning their stats into a role. A mage might be slow and frail but deal lots of damage with their spells, while a thief is fast and hard to hit, but doesn't hurt his opponents all that much. Most games will enforce this diversity by either automatically assigning points upon leveling up, or by making buying non-class stats or skills prohibitively expensive. One of my favorite examples of a system that allows for interesting customization while subtly enforcing characters' diversity in combat is The Legend of Heroes: Trails in the Sky, an RPG developed by Nihon Falcom. In this game, a character's build is determined mostly by the gems they have equipped. For example, equipping fire gems may increase attack, while time gems typically increase speed or reduce cooldown. If many gems of a single element are equipped on a single line, the character has access to far more powerful spells than with a more diverse elemental setup, but at the cost of specializing in one stat. In contrast, trying to raise many stats will result in a lot of survivability and damage, but leave the character without many spells at their disposal. Early on in the game, characters only have space for a few gems each, and some of them are restricted to a single element. While the protagonist, Estelle, has no such restrictions, her brother Joshua is restricted to the time element in a third of his slots. The only time gems available in the early game either directly increase Joshua's speed or reduce his cooldown after using spells, meaning that either way, he's going to be hitting turns more often than his sister. By restricting potential builds for Joshua in the early game, the developers can encourage players to focus on making him fast throughout, which is the most effective way to utilize him later on. Locking characters into one element isn't the only way Trails in the Sky encourages specific builds either. I mentioned earlier that focusing on one element in a character's line leads to more powerful spells. This means that characters with long lines can easily acquire a diverse set of spells, while characters with many short lines are better off focusing on which stats give them gem effects, since they'll never be particularly impressive as spellcasters. This can turn some characters into de facto powerhouses, whose survivability and damage far outpaces characters with the freedom to focus on spellcasting. Of course, games in which the player can only grow with bigger and bigger numbers tend not to have much in the way of longevity. What designers often do is add new abilities to the player's repertoire in order to add variety to the gameplay, as well as a sense of growth. But when adding new abilities, one of the challenges is making sure the player knows how to use them effectively. Fortunately, there's a design principle that's often used here as well, and I call it the sink or swim principle. In real life, children sometimes learn how to swim by being placed in the center of a pool, with nothing to hold on to. They're forced to use the only skill available to them, swimming, rather than relying on the previously effective method of holding on to an inner tube or a wall. What the principle comes down to is, lock the player in an area until they learn how to use a specific ability. This principle is used in almost every Nintendo game I've ever played, but I consider Super Metroid in particular to be the platonic ideal of it. One of the earliest examples is the room that teaches the player to use the run button, which is not only just a fundamental navigation tool in the world, but also critical for using an upgrade required shortly thereafter. On the way into the room, Samus opens a one-way shutter door, which will close her off from the rest of the game. The only way you can go is forward, even if the player doesn't figure out the solution right away. The room itself is structured so that the player will fall through the floor if they aren't running, and can't cheese their way through by jumping repeatedly. Additionally, the room is so long that the player can't accidentally hit a button and solve the problem by chance. Eventually, without any sort of intrusive tutorial or reading the manual, the player learns how to run consistently. This is par for the course for Super Metroid, which sets the player on every new ability as soon as Samus acquires it. The first missiles, super missiles, and power bombs in the game are all immediately followed by a corresponding door that the player must use them to open to progress. The only way to get out of this pit is to use the high jump. Samus will die if she doesn't use the speed boost right away, and the morph ball is needed seconds after it's acquired. Lastly, the secret wall jump and shine spark abilities are taught to Samus by animals in the environment after she falls into a pit from which the only escape is those abilities. The sink or swim principle isn't the only way to floor a player's abilities without an explicit tutorial, nor is it the only one Super Metroid employs. While most players will understand right away that the Morph Ball's bomb upgrade can be used as an attack, the fact they can use it to jump is a little less intuitive. While the game doesn't require the use of the bomb to jump until well after Samus gets it, it does place her in several situations where using a bomb is likely to jump her up a little bit as a matter of course. Even if the player doesn't make the logical leap to try it themselves right away, they will most likely be exposed to this mechanic through normal play regardless. A more forgiving example of the sink or swim principle is used in Ludosity's It'll Do, a top-down Zelda-like game with more focus on puzzles than the games that inspired her. When Idle acquires a new item in this game, she's immediately brought to a tutorial dungeon with none of her previous equipment, aside from the item she just got. Escaping this zone requires learning the various nuances of the item's use, which culminates in a boss fight requiring Idle to use the item to its fullest. As an added bonus, if the player has mastered the use of the item already, they can simply skip the dungeon entirely by using what the game calls professional shortcuts. But since they're pretty tough, most players will probably spend longer on the shortcut than the normal route their first time through. It'll Do also has a number of optional puzzles strewn along the path back to the hub, which can be real head-scratchers. While they can be solved using only the item the player just mastered, it's also possible to come back with a full inventory of tools to solve them more easily. In this way, Ludosity allows the players to pick and choose how difficult they want some puzzles to be, while still ensuring a basic mastery of each tool. Even cutting corners like this, the knowledge gained will be enough to finish the game. But some players might struggle with the harder puzzles the game has to offer. So, we know about ways the player's capabilities can be increased with new items, stats, or abilities, but what if a developer just wants the player to be able to use what they have more effectively, without adding to their inventory or just making numbers bigger? In this case, what we want to improve is not their stats or the number of abilities available to them, but their skill or strategy. In modern, big-budget games, I'd say this is one of the most common methods used, and typically comes in the form of an exam boss. The gist of an exam boss is that it tests the player on their ability to master a concept they've been exposed to in a safer environment, in preparation for that concept to become more common in gameplay from then on. There's countless examples of this, but the one I really want to focus on is Bane from Rocksteady's Batman Arkham Asylum, because he's a pretty straightforward example, and the systems aren't too hard to understand if you've never played the Arkham games before. Generally speaking, the game's combat is reactive, with simple combos that mostly involve mashing the attack button and pointing the control stick at the enemy you want to hit, while looking out for prompts to hit the counter button. After a little over an hour, the game throws you into a room with Bane. Attempting to attack Bane head-on or use the counter will result in Batman getting hit for a sizable chunk of his health. What the player needs to do is throw a batarang at Bane to stun him, followed by a quick dodge, then quickly move in for a few hits while he's dazed. After that, more enemies than the player is used to dealing with at once show up, and the player has to defeat them while also keeping an eye out for Bane's charging attack. If the player can keep this up consistently, Bane will finally go down after 3 rounds. As I noted above, combat up to this point pretty much involved simply hitting the attack button repeatedly, with occasional breaks to hit counter or change your target. The only conditions to win this fight are to use batarangs to stun, to consistently dodge, and to manage fighting a crowd. Fundamentals of Arkham Asylum's gameplay, and things the player's been tasked with repeatedly for the hour and a half prior to this fight. By ensuring they can do all 3 consistently, the developer can tune the difficulty of later fights accordingly, even going so far as to make some of them impressive set pieces, since the player is no longer hung up on learning the basics. The last example I want to talk about is Brock from the original Pokemon games. The game takes no shortcuts in establishing his party's rock-hard defense. Not only do they have some of the highest defense in the game, dwarfing anything Red has faced thus far, but they also show no hesitation in spamming Defense Curl, which can quickly double, triple, or even quadruple their already impressive resilience. On top of that, their rock type handily resists the default tackle and scratch moves the player will be using most consistently. So, the best thing the player can do to defeat Brock is exploit his team's primary weakness, their susceptibility to special attacks. When it comes to resisting special attacks, Brock's party is among the weakest in the game. As a matter of fact, most of the creatures weaker than Brock's in this regard are ones the player would have encountered just a few minutes ago in the Viridian Forest. Much like Brock's team using Defense Curl with extreme prejudice, Kakuna and Metapod have no qualms using Harden every turn to boost their defense. They have no other moves, so it's fairly safe to experiment against them, and the player will likely discover that despite their defense rising each turn, the damage of moves like Butterfree's Confusion, Charmander's Ember, or Bulbasaur's Vine Whip are totally unaffected. This is the big clue on how to pierce their defense and make Brock's rock-hard coterie go down faster than a sack of potatoes on prom night. If you stuck with the video this far, I hope you came away from it eager to look for this sort of trick in games you play in the future, or maybe at least took an interest in some of the games I mentioned. I wouldn't consider this a review of them, but I do think they're all worth playing. If the video was of any interest to you at all, I'd really appreciate leaving a like, and if you guys can think of other games that employ this in an interesting way, I'd love to talk to you about it in the comments, or on my Twitter at Antoids. Lastly, if you want more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, and if it really excites you, you can go to patreon.com and support me there, as I plan on making more videos like this in the future. Next time around, I want to either cover the ways games draw the player's attention to things they might otherwise miss, or the unique ways the medium can convey emotion or tone to the player, things that mediums like literature or film just don't have available to them. If you have a preference between those, or a totally different suggestion, feel free to let me know. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you guys next time.